Dan Flynn here is a senior editor at the American Spectator. And he has written a, frankly, great new book. I'm very excited to talk about this. Before I get to that, I'll just say a little bit about a few books you've written before that are worth reading, including your book, Blue Collar Intellectuals, and your conservative history of the left. So Dan has, I didn't list all his books there, but he has many books that are worth reading. You also have your book called City on Harvey Milk, Jim Jones, and Cultism in San Francisco. So, but of course we want to talk about the main event here.
Sure.
So Dan's book is called The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. So I think not only is this an impressive and an immense achievement, and I highly recommend that all of you read this, I think that actually the title is a great place to start this conversation. I say that because I think that the title itself is rather provocative. So,
Really?
Yes. So what do you mean when you say that Frank Meyer invented American conservatism?
Well,
and as part of that, you also call him a prophet of American conservatism.
do I? I thought I called Jim Burnham that with the managerial revolution. Did I call him?
Yes.
Did I call Meyer too?
Frank,
yes, at the end I do.
In terms of a political prophet,
Oh, okay.
his ability to foresee 25 years ahead of time the Reagan Revolution.
Okay, so
Yes.
take those two separately. I think for the book, I mean, the glib way of answering it is, well, it's just a marketing device, right? A title. No, so I think you could look at it a couple different ways. I mean, one, Frank, his influence on the right with regard to the skeletal structure of the post-war right. I mean, he's a founder of the American Conservative Union. He's at the founding meeting of the Conservative Party of New York. He's present at the creation of National Review. He's at Sharon when they do the Young Americans for Freedom. And not just at Sharon, but if you read the Sharon statement, that's really Frank Meyer diluted when they talk about the three, government being adjudicating disputes through courts, government policing, crime and things like that, and the third function of government being obviously defense. That's Frank. The just interests of the United States being the foreign policy in the Sharon statement. That's Frank. So Frank, a lot of the institutions, Philadelphia Society, that are still lasting to this day, Frank was a part of founding them. And so in a literal sense, philosophically, he's a founding father. But also kind of in an organizational way, he is one of the founding fathers. The reason I chose that title is because when Frank came out of communism, being a left-winger, leftists believe in systems. And Frank thought, to beat a system, you need to have a system. And you get that very early on when, say 1955, he's writing this probably the most eventful essay of his career called Collectivism Rebaptized, which is a kind of a takedown of Russell Kirk, which it was very interesting to. I had been aware of the article, but in sifting through the different papers, I didn't realize Bill Buckley knew that article was coming. I didn't realize the extent to which Frank Chodoroff and Meyer conspired, and there was resentment at Kirk, that Kirk at that point was sort of like the big cheese of American conservatives. And for people like Frank Chodoroff, who had been around, prior to the Second World War, he resented that there wasn't sort of a space for individualism in that kind of a philosophy. And so they did this sort of takedown. At that point, Meyer is so fresh from communism that he thinks, well, you need a system to beat a system. He thought you could invent conservatism. And of course, conservatism wasn't invented, it's developed. It comes about organically. Frank, over the course of my book, comes to that realization. But in 1955, he wasn't there. So in a sense, the title's an inside joke with myself, sorry, but I think it's a neat title. It's going to grab your attention in a way that the life of Frank Meyer, I'm afraid, does not. When Frank was on with Mike Wallace in 1961, Mike Wallace said, Mr. Meyer, I'm afraid that probably 1 of 1,000 of my viewers know who you are, have ever heard your name before. But I am told that Bill Buckley hangs on your every word editorially, and that Barry Goldwater comes and solicits advice from you. Who are you? And so in 1961, if someone's asking, who are you to Frank Meyer, you have to think in 2025, the situation is a little bit more dire than that. The other question you had was...
and thinking of him not only as the inventor of conservatism, but as a prophet as well.
Oh, okay. So
really for a kind of the high mark of American conservatism, if it's the Reagan Revolution.
Yeah. So Frank was very bad with short-term predictions, but was very good with long-term ones. So a little bit prior to the election in 1964, he was such a homer for Barry Goldwater that he wrote in National Review that, well, Goldwater may win in a landslide. Well, the landslide happened. It just, the wrong guy was on the receiving end of it, was buried by it. So he could be very, in some of the letters that I found early on, he was so against Herbert Hoover because of, he's so for Al Smith because Al Smith was against prohibition. And he said, of course Al Smith's going to win. No one wants this prohibition thing. I mean, he's in Newark and New York. And he's going to win a landslide. Everyone I know is going to vote for Al Smith. Well, it didn't happen. So a lot of the short-term stuff Frank was bad at. The long-term stuff, there was an article that I came across written by Roger Ebert when he was a student journalist at he was at the University of Illinois, I believe. And he said, Frank, to the audience there, and he repeated this line at different universities, essentially, Mr. Khrushchev, tear down this wall. Where have we heard that before? 25 years later, we hear that. Frank was prophetic with regard, we talk about Kevin Phillips in 1968 having the Southern strategy, having realignment of the parties. In 1954, Frank wrote in the American Mercury that there's going to be a realignment with the parties. It's going to be Southern Democrats coming together with traditional Republicans, and for Democrats, it's going to be these progressive Republicans coming together with the Easterners and some of the traditional constituencies in the Democratic Party. The big one that he saw, and I think he saw this the moment Ronald Reagan appeared in that infomercial for Barry Goldwater, was that he saw that Ronald Reagan was a star, which kind of makes sense, right? Ronald Reagan was a star. The moment Goldwater lost, Meyer looked at this guy and said, this is our guy. And this brought problems because Meyer had two different roles within National Review. One of the roles, he's sort of the chief theoretician. He's the commissar. Like he kind of was a commissar in the Communist Party. And so for National Review, when he's writing about principles and heresies, that's one role. He has a very different role as sort of the literary editor, the Books, Arts, and Manners. And one of his chief reviewers at Books, Arts, and Manners was a guy named Hugh Kenner. Hugh Kenner was a heavyweight. And Kenner, you can almost look at Kenner and Guy Davenport as sort of like one person. I sometimes confuse them because they were buddies. And Davenport writes Kenner and says, Kenner had written it. Buckley wrote an article in praise of Ronald Reagan in 1967. Kenner wrote a rebuttal saying that, called A Nervous View of Ronald Reagan. When Meyer caught wind of this, he conspired to have a rebuttal to that. And Kenner was like, what's going on? And Davenport said, Frank Meyer thinks that Ronald Reagan should be president of the USA, with a bunch of exclamation points. And in 1967, 1968, I think that for a lot of people that was, he wants Reagan to be president. But he did. And unfortunately for Frank, they recruited Jeffrey Hart to write this piece, but it had Frank's fingerprints all over it. And this led to Kenner's resignation from the magazine. Kenner, who, Bill Buckley had been best man, and he was a widower, and he got married a second time. Buckley was his best man. Buckley had paid for the freshman year of college for one of his daughters after his wife had passed away. Meyer and him were very tight as well. And so Kenner, after this insults, resigned from the magazine. So the point there is that Frank, you can be the commissar if you want. You can be the literary editor. Sometimes you can't be both. And at that point, he couldn't be both. So
going back to your first answer, I think it's a good place to take the next question, which is kind of going back to the beginning. So you talked a little bit about Frank as the communist, the youthful radical. And I think a really good part about this book is when you say the life of Frank Meyer, we really get the full life. So I think it's worth even starting at the beginning and thinking about Frank as a child, his parents, how he grew up, and how he also came to reject, I think, and you're telling in the book, the values of his parents, and that's kind of being the seed of this youthful radicalism that leads to him being this communist organizer on various campuses.
Frank's mother was heavily involved in Jewish causes. She was heavily involved in the temple. Frank's father was a capitalist. He made raincoats and made good money making raincoats, and the company that he founded is still around to this day making raincoats and making umbrellas and things like that. Frank rebelled against both of them. He rebelled against his mother by essentially becoming an atheist, and he rebelled against his father by becoming a communist or becoming more socialistically inclined until he takes that big step in 1931 of joining the Communist Party. And I do think that was a very youthful rebellion. The earliest example that I found of Frank Meyer's writing was, there was a Jewish archive in northern New Jersey, and there it was, a temple newsletter where Frank Meyer is defending Reform Judaism and saying, well, for all these people that think our faith has been is nothing anymore, come on the holy days, come to the temple, see how many people are here. Well, he wrote that when he was 14. When he was 16, he wrote an article, an award-winning piece for the Newark Academy. He won the first prize, where he's defending Bolsheviks, he is defending atheism, and you get a sense that in those 2 years, Frank had changed. It changed more dramatically at Princeton. Frank may not have fully realized how much discrimination that he faced at Princeton. There's a back and forth between his headmaster at the Newark Academy and this guy named Radcliffe Hermines, who was the head of admissions at Princeton. And the fellow who is Frank's booster at the Newark Academy is saying, well, listen, he has some undeniably Jewish features, but he's going to be a good addition to the student body. And Hermines says, his response, and this guy apparently had a reputation for, not liking blacks, not liking Jews. He said, listen, his grades are fine, his scores are really good. Can't you steer him to another school? He doesn't, there are plenty of fine, clean-cut, fine Christian Americans, this is what he said. This sounds like a parody of what someone would say, but this is what he said, that we could give a spot to, that he will take a spot away. He doesn't even strike me as a Hebrew of the better type. And so Frank, and they keep these records at Princeton. You go to a fancy school, they keep all sorts of files on you. And so Frank gets into Princeton, but not on his first try. He has to take a second year, like a postgraduate year at the Newark Academy. And finally, he's sort of indefatigable, so they let him in. But you have to wonder if that same type of anti-Semitism that he faced in admissions, did he face that in the student body? He had a rough time there. At a certain point, I joke about in the book, if you have 2 of the 5 S's, your book's going to do fine. I have all 5 of the S's. I have there is a lot of sex in this book. There are secret agents. There is Stalin. There is suicide, and there is Satan. There are poems Frank is writing, sort of a Hail Satan kind of thing. So it's not like Frank was sort of dipping his toes into communism and to the far left. He was into some evil stuff. And I think one of the reasons he might have got into that last thing is this was his way of rebelling against these fine, clean-cut Christians at Princeton. By the time he goes to Oxford, Frank is sort of ripe for the taking. And in late 1931, he found something called the October Club. There's still an October Club at Oxford. Him and another guy found a communist group. When Frank gets to Oxford, there are 0 communists in the student body. There's a few professors, there's 0 communists. When he leaves, there's over 300 members of the Oxford Club. That people are talking about his club on the floor of Parliament. It's in all the newspapers. And so Frank, being the man, we talked about him being an organizer on the right. He really was the Johnny Appleseed of the communist youth movement in England. In fact, there's 160 pages of files that I got, MI5, MI6, on Frank Meyer. And in those files, repeatedly, he is referred to as the founding, he was the founder of the Student Communist Party movement in Great Britain. This American was the founder. And so Frank had a profound influence on the communists, just like he had a profound influence on the conservatives. But a lot of this was lost to history, and we can talk at some point about why it was lost. And in the case of the communists, it was a deliberate kind of whitewashing of his existence. They redacted his existence.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if you want to say more about that because I had another question about that period of time, but having described a little bit of this, maybe worth talking about what happened to Frank. You talk a lot about this in the book. You said he's got an MI5, MI6 file. Of course, ultimately, you talk about how he got kicked out of the country.
Sure.
And I want to talk about that.
I mean, to me, this is one of the more interesting parts of Frank is his activities in Great Britain. That it's really almost, he's this larger than life character. He is at this time calling for the violent overthrow of the government of Ramsay MacDonald. And at the same time, he is secretly dating Sheila MacDonald, who's Ramsay MacDonald's youngest daughter. And Ramsay MacDonald is a widower, so Sheila is almost acting like the first lady. I have a letter from Sheila MacDonald to Frank, and she says, listen, my dad's not around, the coast is clear, come on over to 10 Downing Street. We'll have dinner. This is how long are you going to last in that country if you have MI5 following you, taking notes on what you're doing? And so they're following him around, talking about what kind of tweed he's wearing. They're saying, he goes to this bar, he does his banking here. They put a mail cover on his correspondence. They do a black bag job on the apartment that he had lived at. They know everything about this guy, but there is nothing in the 160 pages on Frank Meyer that says, yeah, he's dating our boss's daughter. They left that part out. Now, I believe that they probably knew of this. They had to have. But, maybe they missed it. I don't know. Anyway, Frank runs afoul of a lot of people in Great Britain. And because the communists are making big noise, part of it is because Frank is a master organizer. The other part of it is he came along at the right time. The Great Depression is just hitting. So people are more, their brains are a little bit more elastic to kind of think of alternatives to capitalism. So Frank has a great deal of success, and this rubs people the wrong way. At London School of Economics, where he does graduate work under Bronislaw Malinowski, anthropology, he fixes the student body election with a guy named Christian Menon, who later became the second most powerful man in India under Nehru. And Frank becomes the student body president there. After a couple of elections, a couple of tries, and some shenanigans. And in that capacity, they are kind of they're really a thorn in the side of the progressives that are running it. I mean, this was started as like a Fabian socialist school. And Frank accuses one of the professors of being a spy against colonialist students, against his buddy Christian Menon and those people. They kick him out of the school. They ban his newspaper, the Student Vanguard, which is distributed all out throughout England. They take away his spot as the president of the student body. His Rockefeller funding is taken away. His apprenticeship at the British Museum is taken away. And they write the Home Office and say, listen, this guy's got no business in the country. He has no job. He's not a student here anymore. Get rid of him. Thus, Frank becomes a cause célèbre. There is a big petition that circulated. E.M. Forster signs it. Bertrand Russell, E.M. Forster of Passage to India, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, the Dean of Canterbury, signs it. All these sort of famous personages, Nobel Prize winners and such, the kind of petitions that you would see here, like Free Mumia, Free Angela Davis, that kind of thing, Free Frank Meyer. In fact, Michael Straight, who some of the older folks here may remember as the publisher of the New Republic. He also he joined Meyer's movement and later became a kind of a communist spy himself. He remembers marching around London chanting, "Free Frank Meyer, free Frank Meyer." Clement Attlee, who becomes the prime minister in a few years, gives a speech in Parliament defending Frank. And other members of Parliament says, no, kick this guy out. But if you're dating the prime minister's daughter, and you're calling for the violent overthrow of the government, and you're engaging in all sorts of mayhem and causing a ruckus all around the country, you're probably not long for that country. And on June 1st, 1934, Frank was deported. He immediately goes to France. And again, here's a name for some of the older folks in the room. He starts working on peace activism for a guy named Walter Ulbricht. Walter Ulbricht, yeah, oh my God, is right. So Walter Ulbricht at this point had already ordered the murders of people. He was in exile from Germany. He was a communist leader. He was the longest serving dictator of East Germany. He is the guy who erects the Berlin Wall. And Frank is working on peace activism for Walter Ulbricht in Paris. And so Frank's, at that point, is a hardcore communist, comes back to the United States in 1934, doesn't really regain his stature as a communist. You know, he's on the board of the British Communist Party. He's a big wig in the British Communist Party. In the United States, he's kind of a mid-level manager. It takes him about 10 years, but he gets that spot back in the American Communist Party. But it becomes precarious at that point. We can get into that later or not or whatever. But
no, I think a good place to go from there so you just said the next 10 years he kind of slowly works his way up the chain. I think there's two other things that happen in those 10 years that are really important in your book. One of those is meeting Elsie Meyer.
Sure.
The other is his brief time as a soldier, or an officer candidate school, and what kind of effect that has ultimately on his rejection of communism or his change.
Frank gets kicked. Well, I'll skip over some of the part. Frank is sort of the bane of Robert Maynard Hutchins at the University of Chicago. He's a graduate student there. At one point, Hutchins is giving a speech, and they open it to questions, and he sees that Frank Meyer is going to ask him a question, and his response is, "Oh God!" You know, that was Frank's reputation at the University of Chicago. He had 36 classes, and only 6 of them did he receive grades. So he's ostensibly a graduate student. He's really just a guy who causes trouble, a Stalinist, and gets kicked out of there and immediately becomes the director of the Chicago Workers' School. And from there, he's, at least according to Elsie Meyer, his reputation was that of a wolf. And she was warned, stay away from this guy. He likes, some of his female students. And she thought, oh, this guy will never pay attention to me. Well, he was paying attention, and they really connected. And so Frank marries Elsie in 1938. Elsie became important here at National Review as well, and was basically Frank's partner in everything in life. In England, there was a guy that Frank brought under his wing. He was a mentor to. He groomed him to be his successor. And the guy's name was John Cornford. He was the great-grandson of Charles Darwin. And as a teenager, Frank brings him into the Communist Party. And when Frank leaves, he's the leader of the young communists in England. And when the Spanish Civil War happens, he goes over there and he gets killed a day after his 21st birthday. And Frank, I have to imagine, had great guilt about this. The American Communist Party, with all its contortions, with Nazism and all this kind of the alliances, ultimately, they're in a war with the Nazis, and Frank wants to join because they're exhorting everyone else, join up and fight the Nazis. And Frank thinks, well, that's a good idea. I'll fight them too. And the Communist Party said no. Another name, Morris Childs, that people know, he was sort of Frank's boss in the party in Chicago, and said, no, Frank, you're not going to join. And he said, well, what do you mean I'm not going to join? You're telling everyone else to join. Why can't I join? No, that's not for you. We need you here. This goes on for 6 months, 8 months, and finally they allow Frank to join the Communist Party. Up until this point, Frank is a person who experiences life with a lot of social isolation. He goes to a prep school, Newark Academy, fancy prep school in Newark, New Jersey. I know we don't think of Newark as so fancy now, but back then it was pretty fancy. He lived in a real fancy high-hat hotel that opened in 1922. It was the latest and greatest in 1922. Now there's like welfare recipients that live there and the state pays them. But in 1922, where Frank lived, he lived in a hotel. He goes to Balliol. He's not really meeting a lot of plumbers and electricians and assembly line workers. He meets them in the army when he joins. And he thinks, these aren't the proletariat that Marx told me about. They're not these guys that want to overthrow the government. Wait a second. And so there become cracks in his armor. He gets injured in training. He doesn't go and fight. And he spends a year and a half of recuperation. And separation from the Communist Party as a communist is not a good idea, because you're going to start questioning. Questioning and communism doesn't mix. And Frank starts thinking about this. He writes a letter to Earl Browder, who he knew a little bit, but didn't really know at that point, and says, listen, if we want to get bowlers into our party, we're already doing a good job of getting all the hardcore Marxists, but if we want to get bowlers into our party, we need to fuse we need to fuse the Marxism with the American tradition. And we need to fuse Marxism with the American tradition, not just on the 4th of July, but every day of the year. And Browder responds to him and says, yeah, I think, I'm already sort of on it. We're going in that direction anyway. Now, whether he was going that direction or Frank sort of nudged him in that direction, I don't know. Who knows? But the party goes in that direction. Frank was the director of the Chicago Workers' School. Then he comes to New York and he's teaching at the Jefferson School. The International was something that you would play at the beginning of meetings. Now all of a sudden they're playing the Star Spangled Banner. Earl Browder, the former general secretary of the Communist Party, he's now the president of something called the Communist Political Association. So the party is sort of getting the rough edges of the party, they're softening. They're becoming more Americanized because they're allies. The Soviets are allies with the United States. So Frank, in this weird part of the Communist Party where there's a little bit of freedom, Frank writes an article, a book review, for a publication called The New Masses, which was a communist-controlled publication. And a book impresses him, and it's The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek. And probably for the first time in the history of that publication, there was a free market thinker that got a fair hearing. It wasn't exactly a positive review, but you can almost read the review and see Frank Meyer's mind changing and saying, this communism stuff, this isn't where it's at. This guy Hayek, who he certainly ran into at the London School of Economics. They both were there at the same time. They both had Rockefeller money at the same time. And the faculty was sufficiently small that Frank would have known who he was. But Frank writes this review, and you can see Frank is changing in the review. Now, same week that review gets published, there is a letter that comes to the United States called the Duclos letter. This comes from the head of the Communist Party in France, and he's basically scolding the Americans, saying, all this stuff about you guys cooperating with capitalists and class collaboration instead of class warfare, and praising Roosevelt. They're basically warning that a Cold War is coming, get on the right side, drop all this nonsense, Americanize the party. And Frank and Earl Browder, who were championing this, say, no, this is just some French guy writing us a letter. Why do we need to listen to him? Well, Frank gives a speech, and it's sort of like a Jerry Maguire moment. There's all the faculty of the Jefferson School in New York. They're all cheering him on. Great speech. And, let's rebuff this guy Duclos. Well, a few days later, he comes back, and like Jerry Maguire, they're all like, yeah, on second thought, that wasn't such a good idea. And Browder gets kicked out of the party, and Meyer sort of slinks his way out of the party. He's not a conservative at that point. He's not even an anti-communist, but he takes about 5 years, and he gets out of the Communist Party, and he rethinks everything.
I think a good place to go from there, because now you're talking about how Frank exited communism. I think I want to take a turn now to the founding of National Review and Frank's role there. The first place I want to start is, given that Frank was an ex-communist, he wasn't the only one. So I think one interesting question is to think about comparing how Frank changed, how he moved away from communism to conservatism, to some of the other central figures. I think this is actually important because you draw so many contrasts between Jim Burnham and Frank. And I know you also mentioned in the book that when Frank was at Princeton, Jim Burnham's the star student.
Yes.
And then Wilmore Kendall, he runs into, I believe, at Oxford.
Yeah,
as well, right? That they're all coming around up at similar times in the academy. They have a background in radical leftism, but I don't know, how would you describe the differences or similarities and how they changed?
Well, Frank was a hardcore Stalinist. Burnham was a Trotskyist who even his comrades in the Trotskyite movement, they had a similar reaction to some of the people at National Review, including Frank. They thought he was a snob, basically. I mean, Trotsky said that. Trotsky said, listen, because he was tight with Trotsky, and he said, listen, Jim Burnham is not stupid, which is like the understatement of the year. He's just a snob. This other guy he hangs around with, Dwight McDonald, he's stupid. And so So a lot of the American, one of the Trotskyists in the Daniel Kelly biography of Burnham, they said, Burnham, he was among us, but not one of us, if that makes sense. The guy goes to the opera. If he were to buy a hot dog on the street, he'd go and buy a $2,500 hot dog. That's the type of guy Jim Burnham is. Meyer was not really that type of guy, even though he came from wealth. I think Gary Wills exaggerates in his book about conflict between Burnham and Meyer at Princeton. I don't think that existed. It's a nice sort of narrative device, but I don't have any evidence that they had any sort of, interactions at Princeton beyond sort of they knew who each other were. They're in different years, but if you look at their grades, back then a 1 was an A. Jim Burnham's transcript 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, ones everywhere. Meyer's is more mixed. Burnham goes to Balliol College. Meyer goes to Balliol College too. And then later they show up at National Review. And you mentioned Kendall, one of the cool things that I learned in the book, writing the book, and I said, wow, Wilmore Kendall and Meyer met at Balliol. At Oxford, they didn't even know it. So they didn't know, when they reconvene and have a friendship 25 years later, they didn't know that the two of them had met, but they had met, or at least been in the same room. So they all coming at, I think Kendall was a little bit more of a dabbler and was part of it for a shorter period of time. Burnham was at sort of the highest levels in the sense that, when George Orwell writes 1984, he writes an essay about Burnham. He credits Burnham with inspiring part of 1984. Burnham was a really big deal, whereas Meyer was perpetually kind of a big deal to a small amount of people who knew him, but publicly, not a lot of people knew who Frank Meyer was. So when they get to National Review, Billy Schlamm, who who had met Lenin. He was a communist as well, had met Lenin as a 16-year-old at the Kremlin. He gets on people's nerves. He is sort of the anti-James Burnham at National Review. And ultimately, he kind of gets defenestrated. And they say, go up to Vermont, goes into self-imposed exile. Meyer takes his role as the book review editor. He also takes sort of an informal role that Schlamm had been holding, which was the kind of the head of National Review's right wing. He was the anti-James Burnham. And so Meyer was destined to fight with James Burnham on all sorts of issues. And what I would liken it to, Meyer had all sorts of fights with people, and he usually had a pretty thick skin about it. When Meyer had this fight with Russell Kirk in print, Buckley said, that Kirk had a unilateral obsession about the subject, in that he can't talk of anything else but Meyer. And when it was a struggle to get Kirk on the masthead, Buckley went to him and said, we want you on the masthead. He said, how can I stand cheek by jowl with those two guys, meaning Frank Meyer and Frank Chodoroff? He didn't want to do it because Frank was someone that he disliked. So Russell Kirk, the kids say that Meyer was living rent-free in his head. Is that the phrase? Jim Burnham was living rent-free in Meyer's head. I don't know that Jim Burnham thought a lot about Frank Meyer when he went home to Kent, Connecticut, but I know that Meyer and Bazell and sometimes Kendall got along with him a little better, found him annoying. And in fact, one of the cool things I found in the Meyer papers in the warehouse was this letter it's a memo from Bill Rickenbacker from 1962 that is not in the Buckley papers. And I have to wonder why it's not in the Buckley papers, because it's really brutal. It's a memo, a 14-page blistering memo from Bill Rickenbacker saying Jim Burnham's a passive-aggressive bully. He's a sneak. He's a coward. He's always sneaking in liberal ideas into the publication. And Bill Buckley's reaction to that is the opposite of what Frank thinks the reaction is going to be. Bill says, well, maybe we need to make Jim the executive editor. Instead of having a bunch of senior editors, we make a senior editor, and that's Jim Burnham. And you need to rein in Rickenbacker, because if I have to fire him, this will be the darkest day. This will be the darkest day in the history of National Review if I have to fire Bill Rickenbacker, because the memo was sort of out of control. Meyer reins in Rickenbacker. Burnham does not become the executive editor. He's still the senior editor, but it's known that he's sort of the senior editor amongst the senior editors. And so Meyer loses that war. And on some things, Meyer wins the war with Burnham. But if you're Bill Buckley, having a guy like Jim Burnham as your lieutenant is sort of like an overqualified adjutant. This is, he had made a big name for himself prior to coming to National Review. He was also in the office, whereas Meyer wasn't. And increasingly, the three amigos, the three musketeers, Kendall, Bazell, and Meyer, Meyer's in Woodstock. He's not coming into the office. Kendall decides in 1959 he'd rather live in Spain. And then the following year, Brent Bazell follows suit. And they're trying to tell Meyer, you should come to Spain too. Bazell writes him a letter, says the United States is no longer fit to save Western civilization. Spain is the only country that can do that. Come on over here. And Meyer thinks, well, gee, I mean, how are we supposed to edit this magazine? Do you think about the idea of money? How are we supposed to make money over in Spain? We're going to leave the American branch of National Review in Kent, Connecticut with Jim Burnham? This is not making sense to me. And so Meyer decides not to go. I don't think there was much of a decision there. But those guys were constantly doing battle with Jim Burnham, particularly Meyer. And it was personal. There was history there. There was the fact that one was a Stalinist and one was a Trotskyist. There was a political difference there. But I think ultimately Burnham knew Burnham understood what got Meyer going. Meyer was excitable. Burnham was cool and sort of lawyerly. And he knew he could say things to sort of, get Meyer excited and it would amuse Burnham. And I don't know that he ever really figured that out, but that was sort of the nature of their relationship.
Okay, I think there are two great things to pick up there. So one of those is really this. So you mentioned that Burnham wins this war. Now, the way you put it in the book is Burnham wins the battle for the magazine.
Sure.
Control of the magazine. Well, Frank wins the war for control of the conservative movement.
Yeah.
Right? So there's that theme. The other thing you picked up on there is the importance of these deep philosophical, intellectual battles at National Review in the first 10 years or so of the magazine that, as you put it, the Three Musketeers are involved in. Burnham is involved in as well. And I think that's an important part of your book, sort of characterizing this particular era of National Review.
Yeah, and I think that with those guys, Burnham was a smooth operator. Meyer, Bazell, and Kendall were not. I mean, Kendall in his own way was, but there is a letter from Kendall to Meyer in the book, and I have 1,000 letters from Wilmore Kendall that I had the luxury of seeing that no one's seen before except Meyer and Kendall. And in that green ink that Kendall writes, he says, listen, I don't have the book review that you had requested, and I'm afraid this time I don't have a good excuse. Remember that 19-year-old co-ed I told you about? Well, she showed up at my door, and this time I couldn't send her away. And in other words, there's some dysfunction there. I don't know that there's a whole lot of dysfunction with Jim Burnham. He's a guy who can get a magazine off to the presses. I mean, people here work for a magazine. There's a skill to being a deadline editor and getting things done on time, and Jim Burnham had that. And so you would understand why Bill Buckley would want him around, even if philosophically he was suspect. These other guys, Meyer's up in Woodstock. Kendall is having all sorts of personal problems, and Bazell is over in Spain, and he also has problems with his wife and things like that. So a lot of them have, particularly Kendall, has a chaotic life. And so Burnham has his stuff together. There's a philosophical difference between Burnham and Meyer, but with the magazine, there's also a difference in what kind of magazine you want. I think for Meyer, he wanted something like Iskra or Appeal to Reason, something ideological that was going to give the marching orders to the American right. At times, he also wanted National Review to be sort of like a journal of philosophy. And if you read some of those articles by Brent Bazell, in Meyer in 1962, you feel like, well, this was on a newsstand? This is some high-level stuff that's going on. Jim Burnham didn't want that. Jim Burnham was a professor of philosophy, but he thought we need to have a magazine that's going to fit in on the newsstand. Meyer, Bazell, and Kendall, they want a magazine that stood out on the newsstand. And so part of the battle was ideological, but I think the bigger part of the battle is what kind of a magazine. In 1960, Burnham writes a memo to Bill Buckley and says, listen, if we want to hover around 30, 35,000 subscribers, we just keep doing what we're doing. But we've done some strides. We've gotten rid of the technical incompetence like Suzanne La Follette, and he starts bad-mouthing people. And, what do we have in Meyer, writing these book reviews? Who's reading them? And, he thinks it's too highbrow. And Meyer and Kendall and Bazell want a very different kind of magazine. And so there's that battle as well about not just ideological, but what kind of magazine are we going to produce?
So we only have a couple more minutes, and then we're going to do audience Q&A. I think the last thing I want to have you talk about before we open questions to the audience is the back of the book. Because you just talked about sort of a battle over what kind of magazine they're going to produce. And you referenced earlier Frank's role as literary editor. I think one of the really interesting things you get into in the book is this notion that one of Frank's particular talents was to sort of find unvarnished or undiscovered gems.
Yeah.
You have a whole list of these important talents that develop. You mentioned Gary Wills. There's, of course, Joan Didion. And you also have a fascinating look at Theodore Sturgeon, who wrote the Star Trek line.
Live long and prosper.
Yeah, that's one.
We have any Trekkies here? Probably, there's a few. So one of the things, Frank up in Woodstock, one of his neighbors was a guy named Theodore Sturgeon. Theodore Sturgeon was a left-winger. They had a guy at National Review who wrote science fiction reviews. Meyer loved science fiction. And so he's let's get this guy Sturgeon to write the reviews. And as Theodore Sturgeon, and obviously I wrote, I don't know if you, for the people that read National Review, I wrote an article on this in National Review. I find it really interesting because I find Star Trek interesting. I find the history of National Review interesting. Sturgeon is writing these book reviews on Bradbury and Heinlein and all these figures in National Review at the same time that he's writing scripts for Star Trek. And he writes the line, live long and prosper. He comes up with the prime directive. He wrote the episode. He didn't invent this. I can't do it. Who can do it? I can't. Oh, we get some people that are...
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, so I can't do it. He wrote the episode where Nimoy invents that. So he's a big deal in the history of Star Trek. And, maybe Trekkies don't want to talk about it, or maybe Sturgeon didn't want to talk about it, but he's writing reviews. I think he reviewed over 100 books or something like that for National Review over the course of 12 years. Frank, Noel Parmental was Joan Didion's booster boyfriend, and he brought her around all around town. Noel, I used to call him my oldest friend. He's gone now, but I met him when he was 96, so he was my oldest friend. And Noel was a character in and of himself, but he was Joan's boyfriend. I don't know if Joan knew it, but he was also the boyfriend of many other women at the same time. But he brought, for whatever reason, these people weren't taking Didion seriously. And Meyer said she's talented. And so not only, Meyer becomes the first person to publish a freelance article by Joan Didion. And she's such a terrific writer. To spot that kind of talent is a feather in his cap. He didn't discover Gary Wills, but he mentored him. Gary, in his autobiography, says, he spent more time with Elsie and Frank Meyer in the late 50s and early 60s than anyone outside of his family. There is Davenport, Hugh Kenner. There's so many names that you could throw out there. And is this kind of schizophrenic role that Frank Meyer plays, where he's the chief ideologist of the post-war right in the Principles and Heresies column. And then he's this literary editor who really doesn't have any sort of ideological litmus test for the people that are reviewing books. He's just getting people that that are talented that can review books. And if they're not quite conservative, or if they're liberal like Theodore Sturgeon, he doesn't care because they have talent. And so that duality of being kind of an ideologue on the one hand and then having the soft touch with the literary stuff, which was the exact touch it needed, I don't know that you find that combination in too many people.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you for that, Dan. Okay, so we're going to open up audience questions. Let me say one thing just before we get started with that. Just for those of you who have not got a copy of the book yet, Dan will be signing copies of the book once we're done with the program itself. So please take an opportunity to get a copy of the book and have Dan sign one. So let's go ahead and start right here with Peter.
Can you expand on exactly how someone goes from being a communist to a conservative?
Well, of those people that were big shots in the early National Review, I think Bill Buckley was the only cradle-to-grave conservative. So the unusual part, at least of that crowd that was in the was calling the shots in the early post-war conservative movement, would have been what Buckley did, which was to be sort of consistent his whole life. All of the rest of them, Schlamm, Burnham, Kendall, Meyer, even Russell Kirk, had some type of a journey from left to right. In Frank's case, I think it's so unusual because he was a kind of a big shot and a Stalinist. He was a really extreme. I think he went from left to right for the reasons that I gave. I mean, he read Hayek's book. He had this experience in the army. He realized that these guys weren't the proletariat. He realized that the communists were saying one thing and doing the other with regard to recruitment for people for the armed forces. And at a certain point, I didn't mention this, but at a certain point, the Communist Party realizes that Frank is no longer salvageable. And they approach L.C. Meyer, and the Communist Party would do things like this. And they said, listen, Frank's no longer salvageable. He's not something, but you are. We can keep you. We would like you to divorce Frank and stay in the party. Now, L.C. Meyer really loved Frank, and Frank loved L.C., and at that point, they were already ready to go. And so they kind of wormed their way out of the party. I walked by St. Patrick's Cathedral earlier. They had a friend, Louis Budens, who was a famous witness against... and Frank and Louis Budens would conspire about this sort of fusionism within communism. Budens goes out of the party in a very Frank Meyer way. In the morning of, it was October 10th or something of 1945, he is the managing editor of the Daily Worker. And that night, even though he's on the masthead, he's converted to Catholicism by Fulton Sheen, the most sort of flamboyant sort of Catholic priest that there's ever been, the most sort of like glamorous, out there in front of cameras, out there on radio, in St. Patrick's Cathedral, and it becomes in news in every paper in the country. Frank leaves in an uncharacteristic Frank Meyer way. He just sort of sneaks away and goes away, and he reestablishes himself in 1949. They have the longest, most expensive trial in U.S. history, the Smith Act trial, the Foley Square trial, not far from here. Frank is called a mystery witness, a star witness. He's one of 5 people that sends 11 of his former comrades, including Gus Hall and Gene Dennis, to prison. By 1950, and I can't explain exactly what the verbiage was, but I'm reading speech that he gave in Cleveland, Ohio with, we didn't even discuss Eugene O'Neill Jr., his best friend. They were debating partners, and it's unmistakable. He's a right-winger in 1950. You know the sort of language. And so by 1950, he's a right-winger, and he doesn't look back.
Okay, let's go to Kelly next, and then we'll go.
Now, I normally don't ask a question in Q&A if I am able to ask the author something myself, but I can't resist saying, Dan, your talk was a tour de force.
Thank you.
Completely amazing. And I had actually forgotten about Brent Bozell in Spain. As someone who worked at the Weekly Standard when, soon after getting the job, editor-in-chief Steve Hayes moved to Spain. Didn't go as well.
Spain happens.
Right? And he told me that, he wanted his kids to learn Spanish, and everybody was like, just get no care. But anyway, what a tour de force. This is great. And what I'm hoping you'll talk a little bit about is this great piece you wrote for the New York Post about how Frank Meyer had Riz. I think this is great, because by the way,
some of us don't know what Riz is.
Exactly. And it was funny because I changed I changed your Riz, W Riz.
Kelly's a New York Post editor. I wrote a piece for the Post, and it was about how Frank Meyer had Riz.
And I changed one thing, and Dan said, "Well, I hope you don't think that was a typo." And I'm like, "No, but you have to explain it to the average New York Post reader." But it's great, and what I think is great about this is, I was talking to Catherine earlier. We describe ourselves as fusionists. The thing I miss most about moving to New York from DC is the fusionist discussion group that Dawn Devine runs, which Dan McCarthy, my good friend, is in. And I feel like, I'm a fusionist, but nobody knows what that is. And so I hope your book and your pieces that reach out to more people kind of get that term out there. But I would love for you to just talk a little bit about Riz and why that's important.
Riz is Gen Z shorthand for charisma. Frank had it. And one of the things this collection that I found in the warehouse, one of the amazing letters that I found in there was from a guy, a prep school teacher in Pennsylvania, who had hung out with Frank Meyer, had sort of had the Meyer effect, wrote Meyer when Meyer was back in Oxford and said, listen, let's go drinking again. I love when you give toasts, and I love, let's, the books that you gave me, I read all those books. Let's do a Cook's tour of this part of the country. He's basically begging Frank Meyer to be his friend. And then I get to the end of the letter. It's kind of pathetic. And I get to the end of the letter, and it's James A. Michener. Frank had an effect not just on women, but on men. Michener being the guy who wrote Tales of the South Pacific, which becomes South Pacific, one of the most famous plays in U.S. history. There's so many people that he met along the way that were not famous at the time. I mean, I walked here, and I walked by the Museum of Modern Art. Frank, and this may be TMI. TMI is like Riz, another one of these words, but this may be like TMI. Frank loses his virginity to a woman named Dorothy Canning Miller, who at the time was an older woman, and Dorothy Canning Miller becomes the curator at the Museum of Modern Art. She's one of the leading women in American art in the 20th century. And she's a real catch because she's 5 or 6 years older. She's at the Newark Museum of Art at the time. But Frank is probably one of the times in his life where he's sort of head over heels for the woman, and the woman's just like, eh. But there were a lot of these women. I think there's probably 4 or 5 different women that Frank had relationships with that have Wikipedia pages. Do you know how many women in the 1920s have Wikipedia pages now? Not a lot. So not just with his friends, but the women that he dated, Frank, he had an effect on people. He had a certain charisma. He had this kind of riz. And I think that's one of the reasons why you may just think, well, this guy's being salacious. No. The reason why Frank was able to go from 0 to 300 members of the Communist Party at Oxford is because people wanted to be around that guy. If you're looking at your shoes all day, or if you got marbles in your mouth, no one wants to join your movement. But if a bunch of girls want to be around you and guys want to be your friend and go out drinking with you, people might want to join your cause. And so that same kind of riz as a communist, I think, carried over to when he was conservative. And that's one of the reasons why he was so effective, because socially, people wanted to be around that guy. Maybe all these people have been around to enough conservative movement events that not everyone socially has got it together. I think we probably have more than our share of people like that in our movement. I'm probably one of them.
Any woman can tell you this.
Yes, any woman, the women can tell it the most. But Frank had something that people wanted to be around this guy. And that's why so many people would go up to Woodstock, that make that pilgrimage, that spend a weekend drinking, eating, smoking, debating, talking. He might go into an oration about Shakespeare or give a stem-winder speech about why Goldwater should be president. They would go up there and spend all night doing that with Frank Meyer, even if they were 25 years younger.
Let me go to the far back. Alexander, you can go ahead and ask a question. I know you've had a hand up, and then we'll move back up.
Yeah, so my question is there someone out there that is at the level of Frank Meyer, being mixing the political commentary with the book reviews and the arts that you see today? And if so, who do you think would be a modern-day Frank Meyer?
Oh, I don't know. That's a tough one. Dan McCarthy does a lot of good work. You ever see his? Yeah. Dan McCarthy does really great articles that you could, just accessible articles that you can get in the New York Post or in other publications. And then there's some more thoughtful stuff that you get in Modern Age, which he's the editor of. It's tough. There's so many writers that I do it. I mean, most of the writers I don't admire, but there's so many writers I do admire that you could name. And I'm trying to think who would. It's just a unique skill set to be. Here's the thing with the early National Review. There's so many people in there that were extremely talented, and then there were so many people that were sort of ideologically correct. And Frank, I think, was sort of a mixture of the two. I think Buckley, rightly, if you're going to put out a magazine, he thought, I'm going to favor the talented people. And I think he had more, he had some people that were right-wingers and things like that, of course, and some of the talented people were right-wingers too. But he would look the other way if someone was a little bit suspect philosophically, because ultimately you're putting out a magazine. Frank at least in that one section of the magazine, he was able to have that sort of mentality that we're looking for talent. We're not looking for if you're right about about who promoted Perez. We don't care about what you think about William Jenner's amendment. We want the guy that's going to write the best book review.
Jack, we'll go to you next.
So a lot of the book is making a case for Frank Meyer's continuing relevance, that there's aspects of his thought that need to be rediscovered, or aspects of him that have carried over to the present without modern day conservatives even realizing it. What do you say to the people who think actually we do need to forget Frank Meyer? They're out there.
Yeah.
There are people like York Zoni, who essentially blames him for conservatism's wrong turn. There are people who just object to the fact that he overdosed on the freedom side of the freedom versus merger equation. They're out there now. So, and there are also parts of Meyer's thought that are kind of a bitter tonic to where parts of the right are today. There's one column where he says, talking about George Wallace, that populism is the radical opposite of conservatism. So what do you have to say about those aspects of Meyer's thought? What do you have to say to those people who say that we should leave Meyer?
Meyer certainly was not a populist. He was, however, there's aspects. I mean, he was pro Joe McCarthy, and when Jim Buckley ran for Senate, he basically said to Buckley, "Listen, go after the union vote, go after those Democrats. Even in a three-way race in New York, a Republican can't win unless he does that, unless he sort of goes popular." So at least strategically, he understood the need for that. But there's no getting around that Frank Meyer was not a populist, and nowadays people are, populism is kind of a watchword. Frank, to me, the reason why fusionism will never quite go away. I mean, I think of it as the default philosophy of the American right from, say, Goldwater well through Ronald Reagan. It was so popular that I think that people were fusionists without even knowing what the term fusionism was, and not knowing who Frank Meyer was. I think it doesn't go away because it's simple. That if you are a conservative in Great Britain, maybe you're conserving the monarchy or the aristocracy or bad dentistry or whatever it is. If you're a conservative in Italy, maybe you're conserving the Catholic Church. What is the tradition that's unique about America that you want to conserve? Well, it's the American founding. And what does the founding mean? The founding means freedom. So as long as there are Americans and as long as there are conservatives, they're going to say, what is it unique about this country that we want to conserve? It's the American founding, and the founding means freedom. And in that way, he brings together traditionalists and free market people, libertarians, and that's the simplistic, distilled version of fusionism. It gets more complex than that. If Stan Evans' book, The Theme is Freedom, his point was basically, listen, the freedom rests upon thousands of years of civilization. You take away that tradition, the freedom goes away. And that was Frank's view, that freedom and tradition, they weren't in conflict, they were in cooperation. Right, you mentioned Wallace. Frank had a letter exchange with Willy Schlamm in 1968. He says, I'm not afraid of this guy Wallace winning, of course, but I'm afraid of him basically laying forth a template when some demagogue comes along who doesn't have the racist baggage that he has, can come along and sort of knock the conservatives off. And so he despised Wallace, as did most of the people at National Review. And I think that as far as the conservatism today, I mean, it's gone in a different direction, but there are some things that Frank would certainly be comfortable with. I mean, ironically, I think one of the ways he would be most comfortable with Trump is foreign policy. And this is weird because Frank is a person that talked about possibly a preemptive strike on the Soviet Union. So he wasn't all that restrained with regard to the Cold War. In 1968, Henry Kissinger writes him a letter and says, listen, I'm going to be the national security advisor for the new Nixon administration. What should our foreign policy be? And Frank said, well, there's this problem of this messianic crusader state, and they're going around, they're an existential threat to us and to a lot of other nations, so we need to oppose them wherever they go. We need to roll them back. We need to end these people. However, there's going to become a day when they don't exist. And if they didn't exist, the whole idea of foreign aid, of the United Nations, of all these alliances, even the Vietnam War, it would all be a farce. Because what other country's social system is of no business to us. And Frank repeated that a number of times, including in his last article, in National Review, he sort of gets into that. So I think Frank would be very comfortable with the foreign policy stuff. With the populist stuff, obviously with the big government stuff, he would hate. There's no doubt about that. But the way I look at it, I mean, Trump comes up once in the book just to say that that Gene Meyer, his son, was at the Federalist Society, and they, gave all these judges that gave their imprimatur to judges that Trump appointed. That's the only time Trump comes up, because Trump didn't coexist with Frank Meyer, at least as a public figure, and that's a question I get a lot. But I think I get the history right. But when you start saying, well, what would he think of this? What would he think of that? It's not history. It's kind of science fiction. And if someone were to say, well, Dan, you're wrong, he would be on foreign policy. He would really be with these guys. I wouldn't put up a big argument about it, because there's an argument to be made on both sides. But I do think on some things it's pretty clear where he would stand. I mean, obviously on what do we have, a $7 trillion government or something like that? I know where Frank Meyer would stand on that. I don't think that takes science fiction imagination to know about that. But on some of the others, you got to get imaginative. But your other part of the question is, I don't think fusionism goes away. People come back to it. But in the current climate, it's obviously not where most conservatives are.
All right, I'm going to go up here.
Yeah, I'm just curious, how did Meyer come to the attention of Buckley, and how did he also come to earn his trust, especially given his history with communism?
If you look at the prospectus for National Review, even before, I think you have National Weekly up there, before it was even named National Review.
Publisher's statement is back there.
Okay, so they put out, Buckley says, these 40 people are going to be writing for us. There's no Frank Meyer listed there. Frank is a contributor in the early issues. So he works his way up. Frank and Buckley, they had stops at the same publications, just really not at the same time. Frank was at the Freeman, and then Frank's people get kicked out because, Suzanne La Follette, Forrest Davis, and John Chamberlain are like, we're not endorsing Eisenhower. And Frank's like, yeah, don't endorse Eisenhower. They ripped Taft off. Don't endorse Eisenhower. This guy, he's made a truce with the New Deal. We can't endorse this guy. And Henry Hazlitt kind of engineers their exit from the Freeman. Hazlitt brings in his crowd. Meyer leaves. Buckley and Burnham come in. The similar thing happens with the American Mercury. Meyer becomes the book review editor of the American Mercury for a year or so. There's like a bunch of anti-Semitic screwballs that kind of took over that publication. And I think they used Meyer a little bit for cover because he was Jewish. And so Buckley knew of him, but he wasn't a big shot. He wasn't a big shot at that point that his name, of the 40 names they listed, these are the big shots that are writing for us, his name isn't there. So he gained his trust slowly, I think, as a competent book review editor, and also a guy who had his pulse on the finger of the American right, probably to a greater extent than anyone at National Review, other than maybe Bill Rusher. He understood what activist conservatives wanted. And in fact, the famous letter by Whittaker Chambers, he wrote a few letters about Meyer, but one of his letters, he said, listen, Meyer isn't my cup of tea, but from what I gather, talking to people from the conservatives out there, they like him. That's exactly what they want, what Frank Meyer's providing in Principles and Heresies. And so I think Buckley knew enough that the conservatives out in the country were liking Frank Meyer, that he was a right-winger, and they were into him. And so that's part of the reason why he gave him more trust.
Well, that's a great place to end. So I'm sorry, we're going to have to wrap up. If you have more questions, wait till the end, come up and ask Dan, especially while he's signing books. But with that, thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to have a
Appreciate it.
conversation.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you to everyone for coming out.